Good afternoon and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast, the first episode in a while, having I've been off the road myself. We were just discussing the nature of COVID-19. I've been a little unwell this week, but I've made it back to health to host this fantastic conversation today with Dr. Scott Jensen, who returns to the Pandemic Podcast for his second appearance, the doctor who keeps on challenging the data. Now, despite having his medical license reviewed 3 times and banned from various social media platforms, today's guest continues to speak out. He's been a practicing family doctor for the past 35 years, alongside his role as clinical associate professor at the University of Minnesota's family practice, running for governor of Minnesota in 2022. Now, since the onset of the pandemic, Scott has been very vocal about the quality of the data being used in the US, how the CDC guidelines have allowed money to become a motivator in diagnosing COVID-19, and how bad science is continuing to inform policies which negatively impact lives, particularly those of children. So today, we're gonna take it.
Dan, you cut out there, so I did not hear that question.
Oh, sorry. I said it's good to have you back on the show again. Let's start by asking your perspectives on how the current situation is in the US. Obviously, in the UK, we've just had a kind of summer wave, an unpredicted summer wave of COVID. What's the situation in the US at the minute, and how has the media responded?
Well, thanks, Dan, for having me back. I think the situation in the US is, if I had to say one word, I would describe it as chaotic. And I think that the chaos is coming from an absolute loss of public trust in the CDC and the FDA. It's almost been a perfect storm. Within the last 2 or 3 months, we had the FDA make on the surface, a marginal decision to approve a new drug for dementia called Aduhelm, which will be about $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and arguably didn't really demonstrate efficacy, to the point where 3 of the people on the FDA's scientific advisory committee resigned. So you put that amidst some of the pronouncements from the CDC. And I think there's been a flavor just growing and emerging in America about the CDC. If we go back to the very beginning of the pandemic in February of 2020, we might remember that the CDC had come out with its own testing, and that testing was flawed and contaminated, and it had to be shelved, and then they had to come back at it. And there was criticism from people who had been intimately connected with the CDC that at that point in time, the CDC should have reached out to partners around the globe for help. Particularly at that point in time, Germany had good testing available, but the CDC did not. They sort of went it on their own, and it took another 6 weeks. It almost seemed like that initial step is what we've seen more and more of. And over the past week or two, we've seen very confusing recommendations on masks or no masks, masks for the vaccinated, masks not for the vaccinated, or masks for the unvaccinated, but not for the vaccinated. And if you're not wearing masks and you've been vaccinated, but someone walks into the room and they're unvaccinated, then you have to all put a mask on. And so there's been a tremendous amount of shaming. We've said that there's no mandates for the vaccine, but first we lost dignity, then we lost privileges. Now people are being fired from their jobs. There's an almost panic around the nation. I get calls at midnight, middle of the day. I get texts, I get emails from people who are going to lose their jobs. Clearly, we're seeing a certain collusion between the hospital system, because the hospital systems that are saying, if you don't get your vaccine, we're going to fire you, don't want other hospitals to not do the same thing, because those other hospitals then would conceivably pick off some of these very talented employees who are being put in an impossible situation. I think on the whole, Dan, it's been astonishing. If someone had asked me, how do you want to really mess something up? How do you want, create a scenario, write a book, do a screenplay? We're doing it right in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in just 12, 18 months, I think trust for those of us who are paying close attention to this, trust in major institutions has really eroded, whether that's the scientific institutions, whether that's the press, media, government itself. It's really, you're absolutely right. It's a perfect storm. There really is a really mess, and it's become distinctly ideological. I feel it doesn't feel like a scientific discussion anymore. It's more of a political or ideological experience. What's your sense on that statement?
Well, when you said that, Dan, I couldn't help but think, let's just say, what if the COVID virus actually had feelings like a human? I would think that the COVID virus would feel a little slighted. They would raise their hand and say, hey, it's supposed to be about me, but it's not. It's this ideology. And if you don't agree with me, forget the science, forget the facts, forget the data, forget the fact that we're not overwhelming our hospital facilities, that the original 2 goals were to flatten the curve and not overwhelm healthcare facilities. Forget all that. Right now, if you don't agree with me, I don't want to listen to you. I hold you in contempt right from the get-go. And I think the virus would scream, hey, we're supposed to be talking about me. And we're not. We're actually talking now more about the division, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the shaming. How can you dare do this? In Minnesota, we've got a Vikings quarterback who's a very nice man, a very good man. And he's being ridiculed because he's not willing to take the vaccine. And it's almost as if because he's a football player, he's not supposed to have a choice in the matter. And I think, where did this come from?
Yeah. I think I put a post up on Twitter yesterday saying everyone is pro-choice until someone else's choice contravenes your choice, and then they don't want that person to have a choice. It's really this. To me, civil liberties have clearly been threatened by this. That's very evident through lockdowns. But to me, it's the wider liberties, and liberty to me is including the right to choice, and particularly informed choice. And I think when it comes to vaccinations, but because they perhaps questioned this one for good reason, they've got real concerns, they're labeled anti-vax, even if they've taken every vaccine in history. It's crazy how we can't simply look at the situation and ask questions. We can't voice our concerns, and to me, that's a frightening world to live in.
I agree with you. You had mentioned in your byline on your show today something about me continuing to question the data. And I think I've been labeled an anti-vaxxer, which is silly because my children are fully vaccinated, as are my wife and I spend $100,000 a year purchasing vaccines for my patients. But that doesn't stop people from calling me names. And if they feel better, I hope that they get it out of their system, and maybe they can be nicer to the rest of the people they encounter today. But having said that, I would just point out, Dan, that a lot of people didn't know anything about me prior to COVID. And I've always been a skeptic. I mean, I've been critical of how many drugs American doctors push. I've been critical of our healthcare system. I think the idea of taking an 85-year-old person who's never had a heart attack or heart disease and deciding to put them on Lipitor to lower their cholesterol is tantamount to malpractice. So I have said these things for decades. I left a larger clinic 20 years ago and started my own because I felt that we were getting this healthcare bureaucracy that was literally undercutting the role of the patient. The patient is the whole centerpiece of a healthcare industry. The patient should be their own best champion. They should be encouraged to be their own best champion and empowered. And if there's decisions that are too complicated to make without an MD degree or medical school or something like that, fine. The doctor may need to step in and be somewhat more assertive or take the time to make certain that the patient's questions are being answered. But this is nothing new for me to be skeptical. What's new for me is to have my medical license investigated 3 times, to be fact-checked if I say the sky is blue. These are the things that I've never had happen before. I mean, my life pivoted because I read an email from the Department of Health that said, hey, we're changing things up. We're not going to do things the way we've done for the last 20 years when it comes to completing death certificates because COVID's here. And we want you using COVID as the cause of death, even if it did not cause the death. We want you to use it as the cause of death, even if it just might have contributed. We've never done that. But I read that email. I raised my hand and said, hey, this is a problem. There's consequences coming down the stream that are not what we want to see happen. I thought that I would get a response of, hey, thanks for pointing that out. Appreciate it. We'll fix it. That never happened. I was demonized, vilified, and harpooned on a weekly basis. And what happened is I got tougher skin. I dug my heels in. I said, go to hell, folks. I'm not backing down.
Well, good on you. I think it's the right thing to do. And I think there's not enough people that have been willing to do that. But you can see why. People. You mentioned the virus. If it could wave its hand and say, "I've got feelings too," well, so do human beings. And the thing is, we see people who have been questioning, asking valid questions of everything that's been going on, just smeared, ad hominem attacks, just all of these things that we've had to tolerate. But that then sends a message to someone else to stay in line because you risk the public backcry, and for some people, they've got their family, they've got their employment, they've got their all of these different things. We've all got those things, but it becomes a deterrent to actually asking valid questions, which becomes a vicious cycle. I mean, is that something we can burst?
That's an excellent point, Dan. I think we can almost capture some of what you're saying with the word credibility. Never before in my life have I seen credibility change so rapidly. Here's three situations. One is the credibility of scientists and doctors who have had sterling careers and have been highly published, whether it's in Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine. Literally overnight, in the minds of many, these highly esteemed people have become raving idiots because they don't see the world. So their credibility's gone. In America, we use this thing called the VAERS program, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. That has been the gold standard as we monitor, if you will, vaccines that are emerging on the market. The Lyme disease vaccine in the late 1990s, the rotavirus vaccine in the early 2000s, causing deaths in pediatric population because of intussusception, which is a kind of blockage of the intestines. This VAERS program has been highly regarded. It's been the source of information. In Europe, in the United Kingdom, you have your own monitoring systems. But these systems have been, their credibility has been absolutely undercut because they're not giving us the kind of data that we're supposed to see, which would lead us to having the viewpoint we're supposed to have. So we see the credibility of scientists. We see the credibility of VAERS. And then I think we see the credibility of past research absolutely dismissed. We had, since 2002 with SARS-CoV-1, it wasn't like we were all sitting on our hands doing nothing. There was good research going on. There was excellent research being done in Europe. The research was on social distancing. What distance works best? And frankly, in many European countries, it was always 1 meter, which is 39 inches. But for the whole of COVID, it's been 6 feet, 72 inches. And there were some that said it should be 12 feet or 32 feet if you happen to be going by someone breathing hard. But this data was dismissed. This data that said that masks don't effectively prevent the disease and should not be construed by an individual that they're safe if they've got a cotton mask on. All that data got thrown out the window and said, masks are good. There's been almost no distinction made between some lousy cotton mask bought at Walmart versus an N95 mask that, if fitted correctly, has much greater capacity to literally physically filter out particles in that realm of 0.3 microns. These things matter, or at least they did for 20 years. It was like in 2020 and 2021, we said, nuts with that, we'll make our own stuff up. So I think the way credibility has been dismissed on a dime has been truly confounding.
I think that's a really important point. But I think I've witnessed a cultural shift. We've seen, and I don't know how quickly this shift has come. And I've been trying to study all of the kind of factors that surround what we're seeing, from the rise in cultural safetyism and how that's played a role. But also throughout this, we've had the obsession with cases like we've never seen before. We've never in a winter season obsessed over cases of flu, for instance. We've never obsessed over cases of the common cold. We've paid attention to the serious cases and those that are at risk, but for some reason we've now obsessed to almost the point where we're trying to eradicate cases of an illness. And is this reflective of a wider cultural viewpoint around trying to mitigate illness through science, full stop? Is this something that's, are we losing sight of nature? What's really going on?
I think we do obsess more today than 50 years ago. At least that's my impression. But then I'm a lot older than I was 50 years ago too. I think we obsess about many things. And I tend to, I've always said I'd rather be a bit of a naive optimist than a jaded cynic. And when I look at this, I'm hoping that there is a silver lining to COVID. And if there is, one of the things I would like society around the globe to remember is something that I think first world countries in particular have forgotten. I think third world countries have perhaps kept a healthier perspective on what I'm about to say. And that is that life is a fragile gift. Regardless of how much we obsess, how much we scream and holler and pound our fist on the table, life does not become any less fragile. And I think that part of why we're obsessing is because, just take the United States. I don't think a lot of people had paid any mind to the fact that every year, 1 out of 100 Americans die. That every year, 3 million people die. That every year, 650,000 people die of heart disease and 600,000 people die of cancer. And we have usually some 40 to 50,000 people die of suicide, and some 50 to 75,000 people die of influenza. All these things that tell us that life is fragile. There's almost an obsession and a refusal to acknowledge that. And so we're told that you're killing grandma. Well, it doesn't matter to many of these, if you will, anonymous keyboard warriors, that grandma's 94 years old, has breast cancer, colon cancer, and is demented. And I would say it does matter. I would say that if we have a 25-year-old person who at the peak of their early career commits suicide as a part of the collateral damage that occurs, that we've lost someone who might have come up with the next great discovery. We've lost someone that might have had 50 productive years. And we were told by Mayor de Blasio in New York City that he'll spend billions of dollars to save one life. Well, you know what? That's just stupid. If you want to equate the life of a 95-year-old demented person with multiple cancers to a 25-year-old, you are losing perspective. And that's why we have to introduce the concept of QALY. We call them quality adjusted living years or life years. You look at that damage, then clearly the collateral damage of COVID-19 and the policies to mitigate it are far more significant than the actual COVID-19 deaths themselves.
Absolutely. And if I think if lockdowns in Britain, for instance, we had 3 weeks to flatten the curve or 3 weeks to gear up the NHS, most people could have got on board with the idea that, okay, we're going to enable the hospital system to prepare. Fair enough. Because the collateral damage in that period of time, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with the policy, by the way, by saying that. I'm just saying, but by doing so, the collateral damage in terms of education, the economy would be, 3 weeks worth. It's an extended holiday for most. But now, coming up to 2 years, 18 months, 20 months into this, there's been no value placed on education lost, and people don't recognize the spillover effect. A day, the value of each day of education lost is important. But when you have a collective amount of education, it can affect people's lifelong earnings, their employment potential. And of course, if that leads to poor economic outcomes, we can quite very clearly see that those poor economic outcomes lead to poor health outcomes. We've got the hospital waiting list in the United Kingdom. I'm not clued up on the US data, but the hospital waiting lists in this country are record levels of people waiting for diagnosis and treatment, which will have short and long-term ramifications. What about the lives that will be lost through mistreatment? It just seems like they don't get counted because, missing a cancer treatment, you're not going to catch cancer in the street from someone else. So they don't treat it in the same way because they see COVID as a contagion, whereas failing to diagnose a disease, well, it's not going to have a knock-on effect on someone else. But the reality is, as society, it's a huge knock-on effect. So why have we placed so little value on these other factors, do you think?
I think because we made a critical mistake very early on. And we said, we're going to focus to the exclusion of all other things. We're going to focus on one disease. We focus on COVID. As a family doctor in the trenches, so to speak, two things jump out at me in light of your comments. One is I had a mom in perhaps 2 weeks ago, and I was doing the well baby visit for a 4-year-old. And I said, well, there's a couple of vaccines that we could give as your child's going to be going into kindergarten. And she just shook her head and said, Doc, I'm just so tired of this whole thing and the bickering, and I don't know who to trust anymore. And I have had all my kids fully vaccinated all the time, along with Johnny, but I'm going to pass today. I'm just not going to put any vaccines. I just don't know what to think. We weren't talking about a COVID vaccine. We were talking about your more standard diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, and things. I think that concern has been raised before, but for me 2 weeks ago, it was just crystallized with this one encounter. And then I think the other encounter that I had within the last month was this woman who has been diagnosed with breast cancer. And we thought that we were getting it early. The mammogram detected it, and she had her surgery, and they did a sentinel node biopsy in the armpit. And unfortunately, the nodes are positive. It changes everything. And she broke down in my office saying, I should have done this sooner. And I said, well, I think the best way to go is we have to deal with the here and now. Here's where we're at. We still have a good chance of winning this battle because breast cancer treatments have really improved. And she said, yeah, but she said, let's be honest, the horse is out of the barn. I've got a lot of chemotherapy coming up. And she said, I should have gotten this done sooner. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And she said, well, with the COVID thing, I knew I should have had my mammogram. And I just put it off. So by the time I had it, there was literally a 2-year gap. And I have a positive family history. And here I am. And so your concern regarding delay in diagnosis is absolutely powerful awareness that we have to come away from. We have literally focused on one disease to the exclusion of virtually all others. Americans are incredibly insensitive to the fact that people die of hunger around the globe every day, that more than 1 million people will die of tuberculosis this year around the globe. We need a broader perspective, but instead we have this shaming and this just contemptuous perspective for others who are not willing to protect grandma to the extent that they are.
Yeah, it's quite frightening. And then we've looked at some of the interests that may have played a role in this. What about the role of the pharmaceutical industry itself? We've talked about government overreach in the past. Is there a sense that there is a pharmaceutical overreach? Is that something that could be evaluated?
Absolutely, there's a pharmaceutical overreach. I think when we look at big pharma, we have to look at, well, let's just take Pfizer. And I've always appreciated the work Pfizer's done. Pfizer's the company that I believe they did Z-Pak, Zoloft, Viagra, Lipitor. They've got a winning streak with medications that have helped change lives. And yet Pfizer this year alone, from the COVID-19 vaccine, they will generate over $33 billion from just COVID-19 vaccine products in 2021. That's more than the general fund budget for the entire state of Minnesota for a year.
Mm.
And this is the 33 billion will approximate 50% of Pfizer's total revenues. So you say, well, what does that mean in and of itself? Well, Pfizer is starting to push for the booster. We don't know that we need a booster. We haven't even had scientists speak to the issue of how do we measure antibodies? What should be a protocol? What would be the determining factor that a booster needs to be used? But for Pfizer, as a corporate pharmaceutical company, a booster is a guarantee of recurring revenue.
Mm.
Pfizer increased the cost of its vaccine by 25%. Pfizer's vaccine is sold on the market it's more than double the expense of other COVID-19 vaccines in the market. Pfizer knows exactly what they're doing, making money. And you start to watch, who does Pfizer intersect with more outside of the pharmaceutical industry? Big tech. Watch the two. Watch big tech and big pharma. Watch them invest in one another. Watch big pharma buy into big tech companies. Watch big tech companies buying their own pharmaceutical companies. And then watch big government grease the pathways so that these things can happen. We're going to have to put a new set of lenses on our eyes. And that lens is going to have to be that triad of pharma, tech, and government. This lens is absolutely controlling our lives, controlling the information stream, controlling the things that we think we need in order to stay alive, even if we don't. In America, we have less than 5% of the world's population, but we take some 30, 40, 50% of the prescription drugs of the entire globe.
Yes, it's quite shocking. I mean, some of the data you've shared there is quite mind-blowing. And I think, you know, if you can, for those who are wearing those lenses, you can see the influence of that power and what that brings. It's for most, which I find quite shocking, is that people aren't even open to seeing that there could be outside influences that are playing a role in this. And, you know, you've mentioned big tech. You know, you and I have both experienced censorship. You know, I consider myself to be well researched. We do a lot of internal fact checking to make sure what we present is credible. We vet all our guests. So work very hard to bring credible information to the podcast. Yet just had my channel taken off YouTube, which we're contesting, but and I'm quite hopeful we can get that one overridden. But it's shocking. Yourself, you've experienced censorship. You know, the kind of the digital public square, if you will, is closed to debate. This may be the first major global event in terms of a pandemic or epidemic that's been in the presence of such widespread digital media, social media, etc. And therefore, you know, perhaps there is a role to play to make sure that information has certain levels of credibility. But we've seen just it shut down. I mean, what is a sensible approach for social media to take around free speech in a pandemic?
It almost, for me, gets back to the First Amendment in our Constitution. When the freedom of speech is protected, what does that mean? Does that mean that only if I tell the truth is it protected? And what if I'm telling the truth as I see it today, but I find out tomorrow it wasn't? Is that protected? To me, the First Amendment has to protect my ability to lie in order for it to protect my ability to have free speech. Now, it doesn't have to protect my ability that I can't slander someone else. But if I speak my truth and it's different than your truth, then if we're going to say that the First Amendment doesn't protect both of us, then the First Amendment really isn't about freedom of speech. So, you know, I think we're starting to puzzle over this a little bit more. And democracy as the beacon for independent, free living, independent control of our lives, democracy has to be our banner, whether you're in the United Kingdom, Europe, Asia, or the United States. And we have literally seen a change in prioritization. We're saying that lifespan is more important than liberty. And yet it's almost, in some areas, it's almost a 50-50 split. Some are saying absolutely not, but many are saying yes. And the ones that are saying that lifespan is more important than liberty are the same ones that are saying that we're not going to let you come in these buildings. We're not going to let you shop at this grocery store. I had a person call me the other day asking me if I'd be his doctor because he'd gotten an email from his doctor saying that since you're not going to get a vaccine, we don't want you in our clinic and we're dismissing you. How puzzling is that?
Goodness me. It's puzzling, it's putting it lightly. Absolutely. We find ourselves in these situations. I mean, I received the news that New York City is obviously putting very strong restrictions in place again to favor the vaccinated. I think the governor in in New York City essentially said that, the vaccine has to be a way of living. It's a way of living a healthy life. And if you're not willing to get on board, then your rights will be minimized.
Dan, in response to that, I would ask this: why is the data in the United Kingdom and Israel, why does much of that have a conflict with the data from the United States? Why within the United States do we see an area in Massachusetts where 75% of the cases are, if you will, in the vaccinated? Why this disparity? I mean, doesn't it plant this doubt that people are really telling the truth? Doesn't it make us think that statisticians and bureaucrats and epidemiologists will massage the data until they get it to take the shape they want it to take?
Yeah.
This is just so mind-boggling for me because I don't think that we know that the vaccinated are any less likely to contract the disease, spread the disease, and be as much of a problem as the unvaccinated. And I would submit that the data I see indicates that those who had COVID, recovered from it, saw the whole virus, had a chance to create antibodies to the spike protein, to the nucleocapsid, to various antigenic particulate matter on the COVID vaccine particle. I would submit that the data is showing more and more clearly that the robust immunity we get from recovering from the disease naturally is far superior to that which you get through these vaccines. And yet we're basically because I've had it and I've got the antibodies and I've donated to the blood bank and I've donated my plasma, but I'm basically being excluded from the calculation of what constitutes herd immunity. That's not science. We've had herd immunity around for 110 years. The veterinarians were the ones who really crafted the concept as they dealt with herds of cattle getting sick. And when did they get to a certain herd immunity so they knew that the cattle weren't at risk any longer? This has never been done before. When we look at measles and herd immunity, we don't say everybody's got to get the vaccine. We say, well, we got the vaccinated and we got the people that were born before 1957 that we assume had the measles. Those two are the things we add up. You don't know if you're immune to measles. We don't necessarily jab you with the measles vaccine. We frequently tell you, check your antibody titer. And if your antibody titer is okay, you don't need the vaccine. If your antibody titer for measles is not okay, you need a booster. That's more scientific, but we're not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I had a doctor on here recently who was talking about his observation. I mean, again, he was a very pro-vaccine individual, but he was talking about screening for antibodies prior to vaccination because his observations of the data had shown a higher risk of adverse reactions amongst those that had previously exposed to the virus. And it just seems like even if he's wrong, it just makes sense to ask that question, to look at the data, to look at the role of antibodies. I mean, again, if you look through history of science, we know that natural immunity plays a significant role, but it's the World Health Organization, it was labeled as a conspiracy that they changed the definition of herd immunity. It's in plain sight. You go on their website and it's very clear now. It stipulates very clearly that getting immunity naturally is basically being disregarded because it comes with too much risk. They've literally taken that approach. Yet you cannot discount the role of natural immunity. And the sad part is, going back to big tech, now when you start to search for the papers on that has studied immunity following post exposure to the virus, they're reaching lower and lower priority, and you just keep seeing the vaccine orientated papers above the ones that have explored natural immunity. It's almost like it's not a thing anymore. It doesn't count.
We've made George Orwell's 1980 look like an incredible book of prophecy.
Yeah, I've got Brave New World on display behind me there. You can probably just see it. But you're absolutely right. Now, out of all of this, to me, one of the biggest benefits has that this I go back to what you said previously. It's basically shown us that we've got a complete mess. But I do believe inside of that mess, there's always an opportunity. And I think what this has shown us is where there is room for change and room for systemic adjustments, structural change in order to drive things forward. I know you're challenging for governor where you are. What are some of the things that you're standing for? And more broadly, over the longer term, where do you think some of the greatest opportunities are for change so that we don't go through things like this again?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that. Having spent 4 years in the Minnesota Senate and having a taste of how dysfunctional the political system is, I would say one of the opportunities is in the area of recognition of what our weak spots are. And one of our weak spots is that when you let appointed bureaucrats, and I'll pick on Dr. Fauci here, when you let someone like him assume a position of such potential tyrannical power and authority, and that person's never really accountable, that's extremely dangerous, because I think we have tremendously talented epidemiologists, scientists, doctors available that aren't being tapped at all. We could mention many names, but these people would have been probably far better equipped than Dr. Fauci as someone who hasn't been seeing patients in the trenches and arguably is a bit distanced from some of the critical things that should be considered now. He may be so much into his atmosphere that the collateral damage that's being caused doesn't weigh in as heavily as it should. So I think one of the opportunities is to regard the role of the bureaucrat. Should there be a changeover? Should we stagger that so that the changeover doesn't occur necessarily with a new political regime, but instead it occurs on the off cycle, but it has to occur? Should there be term limits for appointed bureaucrats? I think that's one of the opportunities. I think a second opportunity is to refresh ourselves in regards to what is science versus what is political science. Mm. Politicians have become so effective at pandering to the wishes of the masses in regards to getting voting blocks and winning the next election, that the pandering isn't even recognized. But the bottom line is politicians pander and purchase votes with the influence that they can bring to bear on trying to give a large group of people something they want. And if you give someone enough, those people will always be there for you because they don't want that faucet, that spigot of good things flowing their way to be interrupted. So I think there's that opportunity as well, that the political pandering is excessive. And I think that we have to craft better legislation so that in the midst of a public health epidemic, we cannot let governors or leaders of countries literally unilaterally take over, expand their power base, declare an emergency and declare it for 15 months when clearly the initial two objectives of flattening the curve, not overwhelming healthcare facilities, those two objectives have been accomplished, but that did nothing for stopping the political leaders from assuming more power than they ever should have. To me, these are some opportunities that we have to recognize. And then as we move into our next election cycles around the globe, particularly in the free countries, we got to make changes.
Mm. Scott, thank you for that. And thank you so much for your appearance here again on the Pandemic Podcast. Again, a fantastic conversation, and good work on everything you're doing and upholding the standards that you do. And best of luck in your run into governor in 2022.
If people want to learn more about us, they can go to drscottjensen.com, DrScottJensen.com, because I think a lot of the things that we're talking about here today, Dan, are explored on our webpage, because our campaign is nothing more than a mirror image of what you and I have been talking about.
You call out that link again, please, Scott?
drscottjensen.com.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We'll make sure we distribute that with the show. And thank you again for being a great guest. And it's wonderful to have you again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And if you haven't already subscribed to the Pandemic Podcast, please just take a few moments of your time just to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic to make sure you're subscribed to receive our latest content. And please do also check out drscottjensen.com and sign up for his newsletter as well. Thank you very much for everyone with us today, and we'll see you again next week. Have a wonderful weekend.